In Exodus 7:10, a staff transformed into a snake. More precisely, that staff became a law snake. The Hebrew lamed prefix of the Hebrew noun tannin, la tannin, clearly indicating the transition. Even evolution deniers will admit that that was a transformation from third-day creation, a branch of a tree, into a sixth-day animal, a snake, more precisely a law snake, a transitional snake. If only Genesis chapter 1 had such Hebrew grammar, we would see a reference in Genesis chapter 1 to transitional animals. And so it is. For instance, the Hebrew words laminah and lamineu appear in Genesis 1:24 through 25, the Hebrew lamed prefixes thereof clearly indicating transitional sixth-day animals. Nobody of sound mind will even think of denying that the Hebrew lamed prefix indicates transition. In Genesis chapter 1, the dynamic transit quality of the Hebrew lamed prefix, of the 10 appearances of inflected forms of the Hebrew noun min in Genesis chapter 1, reference the dynamic quality of creation, evolution. Although the Hebrew words laminah and lamineu in Genesis 1:24 through 25 might sound unfamiliar to you, a common English translation of those words, after his kind, might be very familiar to you. However, as you can see, the English translation, after his kind, does not clearly convey the transition of evolution as does the original Hebrew, laminah and lamineu. Exodus 7 clearly shows you and the world that Yahweh is the God of evolution. In Exodus 7:1, God revealed that Moses was a god to Pharaoh. And then in Exodus 7:1, God said that Aaron would be Moses' prophet. Now, carefully meditate on Exodus 7:9 through 10. In Exodus 7:9, God gave Moses specific instructions. Verse 9, when Pharaoh says, perform a miracle, say to Aaron, take your staff and throw it down in front of Pharaoh, and it will become a law serpent. Verse 10, so Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did what the Lord had commanded. Aaron threw down his staff in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a law serpent. Carefully meditate on that scripture. God instructed Moses, God's prophet, to use his hand to, with a utensil, write Genesis chapter 1 and use the lamed prefix to testify to you and all the world that God is the God of evolution. Moses, a god to Pharaoh, instructed Aaron, Moses' prophet, to use his hand to throw a staff down in front of Pharaoh as a display to Pharaoh and his officials, and that involved the scriptural testimony of the lamed prefix, la tannin. And Exodus 7 continues showing you and the world that God is the God of evolution. Exodus 7:17, the water that is in the Nile will turn to blood. Exodus 7:20, Moses and Aaron did what the Lord commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, he lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile, and all the water in the Nile turned to blood. In Exodus 7:17 and Exodus 7:20, a lamed prefix is attached to the Hebrew noun dam, Strong's 1818, which is the Hebrew noun that means blood. The inflected Hebrew noun la-dam appears in Exodus 7:17 and Exodus 7:20. Exodus 7:17 and Exodus 7:20 mention la-dam, transitional blood, blood that transitioned from water to blood, and the lamed prefix of la-dam clearly indicates that transition. Profoundly, Waters transitioning into blood in Exodus 7:20 evokes the Genesis 1:20 prophecy that waters would bring forth marine animals. Fifth day transitional marine animals. The lamed prefix of the inflected Hebrew noun lamineu in Genesis 1:21 mentions the evolution, DNA transit qualities of fifth-day marine animals. Furthermore, in order to understand the countless instances of environment-driven evolution mentioned in Genesis 1:24 through 25, you do need to remember that Genesis chapter 1 includes ongoing creation. For instance, in Job 40:15, God mentioned a behemoth that he had created in a womb in the days of Job, circa 1800 BC. That animal was a Genesis 1:25 behemoth laminah, evolved animal that God created in a womb prior to the preterist fulfillment of Genesis 2:1, the completed universe verse. And you should understand the Hebrew verb yatsa in Genesis 1:24. See the description box below. Jesus is the Messiah of Isaiah 9:6, exactly as declared in Luke 2:11.